Welcome to Parliament Through Time podcast. I hope you are all well and safe. This podcast is about the origins, development and current practices of the institution of Parliament in Europe and the Middle East. Each week we will deliver an overview of certain key topics to enhance our understanding of parliamentary life, what lessons we have learned from the past events, and how these lessons learned can be applied to today's practices. We start today with discussion on how the institution of Parliament came into existence and what the first discussions and aims were. The podcast series is produced by the Westminster Foundation for Democracy in the framework of the European Union Support to Jordanian House of Representatives programme. Marko Vujacic, the Committees and Oversight expert in the programme, prepared the content of the podcast. I am Lamasawi, your host for this podcast from the heart of Amman, Jordan. So let's start. No institution is perceived so close to the notion of a democratic government as Parliament. To date, no country can be called a true democracy without having a functioning Parliament. Parliaments perform important functions in a democracy. They represent people, they pass legislation and monitor its implementation, and oversee the operations of the government. Yet, parliaments were and remain amongst the most criticized institutions worldwide, mostly because they're amongst the most exposed and most transparent institution to the general public. So, how did the institution come to existence? It is widely perceived that the first institution of Parliament, in the way we know it and understand parliaments today, originated in the far-away island of Iceland upon the birth of the Icelandic nation in the 10th century around year 930. Alþingi is the nation's oldest institution, and also the highest. Its foundation was connected with meetings in the mountain Þingvellir, which means parliamentary plains. There, high in the mountains, the leading chieftains met to discuss various matters, pass decisions and laws, and dispense justice. Every year, Alþingi assembled around the middle of June for a session of about 2 weeks, and all free and law-abiding citizens could attend. Those attending the assembly dwelt in temporary camps known as budir during the session. Camps were established with intention to ensure conditions for members to reside, and thus freedom to observe the proceedings without pressure of now having a place to stay during the session. Alþingi was well attended, as it was the centre of power and interaction. Lögrétta, the Law Council, was at the heart of Alþingi's proceedings. The council ruled on legal disputes, enacted new legislation, and granted exemptions from law. Lögrétta comprised of chieftains as the first representatives of the people. In time, members of Alþingi were accompanied by non-voting advisors. In terms of procedure, decisions in Alþingi were made by simple majority. The Speaker of Lögrétta, the Law Council, was the highest official of Alþingi. His role included reciting the laws of Iceland in the days before Iceland had a written language. He recited the rules of parliamentary procedure, chaired sessions, and settled disputes. The Speaker is believed to have addressed the assembly from the law rock Lögberg, which appears to have been the place where verdicts were announced, important speeches made, and where the assembly was formally opened and dissolved. Of course, Icelandic Alþingi was not the first time a group of people gathered to make decisions. Forms of gatherings similar to parliaments existed since the dawn of humankind, when people still lived in tribal communities. They were usually done in some forms of the councils of elders conducted within the village or tribe. When the first societies and states emerged, some of these practices were preserved. In his article, Primitive Democracy in Ancient Mesopotamia, Danish historian Thorkild Jacobsen argues forms of democratic representation existed in prehistoric Mesopotamia, particularly in Assyria and Babylonia, while historic Mesopotamia spells a clear shift towards autocratic government. Democratic forms were mostly present in the area of judiciary. As a particularly striking example may serve the Assyrian merchant colonies in Asia Minor. There, as Jacobson writes, the highest judicial authority was not vested in any one individual, but resided in General Assembly of all colonists. This General Assembly was called into session by a clerk at the bidding of a majority of its senior members. The General Assembly tried and decided on lawsuits which arose in the colony. In Babylonia, for example, in the matter of war and peace, a king had to make a decision only after he obtained the consent of an assembly, in which, therefore, internal sovereignty of the state would seem to be vested. Jacobson concludes that this points to a form of government in which normal run of public affairs was handled by a council of elders, but ultimate sovereignty resided in a general assembly comprising all members, all adult men of the community. Later on, the first recorded signs of a council to decide on different issues in ancient Iran dates back to 247 BC in the Parthian Empire, the first Iranian empire since the conquering of Persia by Alexander. By the early years of their reign, an assembly of nobles called Mehistan was formed to make final decisions on very serious issues. Mehistan consisted of religious leaders and clan elders and exerted great influence over the administration of the empire. In Europe, ancient Athens was considered the cradle of democracy. The Athenian assembly, the ecclesia, was the most important institution, and every male citizen above the age of 30 could take part in the discussion, but no woman, no men under the age of 30, and no slaves were allowed to take part in the discussions. However, Athenian democracy was not representative, but rather a form of a direct democracy. This means that all free male citizens were allowed to gather in the city square, debate, and make decisions. They were representing themselves as free citizens, but they were not representatives of all citizens and they were not elected. Therefore, the ecclesia was different from the parliamentary system as we know it today. The Roman Republic had legislative assemblies, which had the final say regarding the election of magistrates, the enactment of new statutes, the carrying out of capital punishment, the declaration of war and peace, and the creation or dissolution of alliances. It was not elected body, but one whose members were appointed by the consuls, and later by the censors. The former American Senator Robert Byrd, in one of his famous filibusters, describes the Roman Senate as having complete control over the purse. It determined the foreign policy, executed foreign policy, made and ratified treaties. It approved or disapproved legislation. It approved the election of magistrates, and it determined who would be entrusted with the powers of dictator in a time of crisis for the Roman state. The Roman Senate was the guardian of the Roman state. It was the conscience of the Republic. The Roman Senate was preserved as an institution during the time of the Roman Empire. However, its role has been substantially diminished. Moving on to the Islamic world in those times. Some Muslim scholars argue that the Islamic Shura is analogous to the parliament and democracy. However, some disagree, highlighting some fundamental differences between the Shura system and the parliamentary system. Shura is a decision-making process, consultative decision-making, that is considered either obligatory or only desirable, depending on Islamic scholars' interpretations of Holy Quran. Dr. Muqtadir Khan, in his article, Shura and Democracy, argues that those scholars who choose to emphasize the Quranic verse and consult them in the matter consider Shura as obligatory. However, he continues, those scholars who emphasize the verse, those are praised, whose affairs are settled with mutual consultation between them, consider Shura only as desirable. In the Jordanian House of Representatives, the very same verses from Quran are written at the entrance of the plenary chamber, suggesting that the parliamentarians should discuss their issues between each other and, before you take any decision, consult them. Suggesting that the parliamentarians should consult with people whom they represent. In Anglo-Saxon England, the Witan was an important political institution. The name derives from the Old English for meeting of wise men. The first recorded act of a Witan was the Law Code issued around year 600. The earliest document which survives in sustained Old English prose, however, the Witan was certainly in existence long before this time. The Witan, along with the folk moods and local assemblies, is an important ancestor of the modern English Parliament. Sounds good. So what makes these proto-parliaments different from today's parliaments? Firstly, their narrow powers and competences, usually limited to only a handful of issues. Secondly, they are characterized by the irregularity of their work. They met exceptionally and existed for some time, and then they would be dissolved or abolished. Finally, they almost exclusively gathered nobility and religious elite, charmed circle of monarchs, trusted noblemen, wealthy oligarchy. They were not open to the middle class or common people. In essence, the Icelandic Alþingi represented a turning point. For once, it created regularity of the institution. Since the establishment, it has been assembled every year in regular times, even in times when Iceland was ruled by the Kingdom of Denmark. The Alþingi continued to exist, but served almost exclusively as a court of law until the beginning of the 19th century. In southern Europe, in the Iberian Peninsula, 200 years after Iceland, the first parliamentary body started to evolve with the inclusion of representatives of the urban middle class. They were summoned in Castile, one of the Spanish kingdoms at the time in 1187. When Castilian King Alfonso VIII summoned representatives of the nobility, the church and the 50 most important cities to a council in the town of San Esteban de Gormaz. There was another meeting with representatives of the cities in Carrion de los Condes the next year. However, all those meetings were exceptional and not leading to a regular attendance of town representatives. In Leon, another Spanish kingdom, the Cortes was established as a regular parliamentary body from year 1188. According to the UNESCO Memory of the World Programme, it is the oldest documented manifestation of the European parliamentary system with some temporal continuity. After coming to power, King Alfonso IX of Leon, potentially facing an attack by his two neighbors, Castile and Portugal, decided to summon Curia Regis, the royal curia. In the 12th century, Curia Regis was the name given to the assembly, whether in England, France, or the Spanish kingdoms, which helped the monarch to govern. In its largest form, such an assembly consisted of members of the royal family, royal household officials, and the religious magnates of the kingdom. But because of the seriousness of the situation and the need to maximize political support, King Alfonso IX of Leon took the decision to also call the representatives of the urban middle class from the most important cities of the kingdom to the assembly. Leon's Cortes dealt with matters like the right to private property, the right to appeal to justice opposite the king, and the obligation of the king to consult the Cortes before entering a war. In the realms of the Crown of Aragon, the institutional system effectively limited powers of the monarchs, particularly in the Principality of Catalonia in 1283. The Catalan courts became one of the first parliamentary bodies of Europe that officially banned the royal power from creating legislation unilaterally. Throughout the next centuries, the courts developed an extensive regulation of its internal operation and guarantee of rights for the citizenship. In 1481, the Catalan courts approved the constitution to respect, which established the submission of the king and its officers to the laws of the principality. In medieval England, the Magna Carta Liberatum, or the Great Charter of Freedoms, was enacted in the year 1215 by King John, which among other things imposed limitations on feudal payments to the crown, to be implemented through a council of 25 barons. Neither side stood behind their commitments, and the charter was annulled. After the death of King John, the regency government of his young son, Henry III, reissued the document in 1216. And then the charter was reissued subsequently by English kings. In essence, the charter included provisions that prevented unlimited spending of funds by the king and the need to consult nobility for issuing new taxation, which soon after led to the formation of the first parliaments. Simon de Montfort, a nobleman of French origin and a member of the English peerage, who led the baronial opposition to the rule of King Henry III of England, is remembered as one of the fathers of representatives government for holding two famous parliaments. The first, in 1258, stripped the king of unlimited authority, and the second, in 1265, included ordinary citizens from the towns. Later, in the 17th century, the Parliament of England pioneered some of the ideas and systems of liberal democracy, culminating in the Glorious Revolution and passage of the Bill of Rights in 1689. In sum, these events from Iceland, medieval Spanish kingdoms, and medieval England were the first ones to resemble the birth of an institution of parliament, as we know today. And from these first attempts onward, history has spelled the expansion of parliamentary powers over time. The consequence was limiting the monarchical powers, establishing their regularity in assembling the institution, and expanding the representation, from nobility and clergy to territorial representation of towns and with them an urban middle class. You listened to the first episode of the podcast Parliaments Through Time, where we explore the origins and reasons for the emergence of the institution of Parliament. I hope you enjoyed our short historical journey through beginnings of parliamentarism. Next week, we will move to explore the topic of how parliaments emerged as central political institutions during the 19th century. Stay tuned and stay safe.